Good evening, YouTube. Jonathan here, also known as Lala Wen. That's right. So I'm a little bit late. I wanted to do chapter 5 and 6, so go ahead and sit down for the next hour and a half, 2 hours, and be prepared to be incredibly bored by my monotone voice and my lack of funny jokes. Just kidding, I am working on that. Okay, chapter 5 is called Awakening. I've got my notes here that I will not show you, but I think what I'll do is I'll copy-paste them into the video description. So pardon me for not looking directly at the camera as though I've memorized everything clever that I want to say. I'm going to read my notes. Keep it kind of short and to the point. Chapter 5, called Awakening, holds in its context. I'm going to start that over. Okay. Chapter 5 holds in its contents the birth of the baby blue dragon that is currently unnamed and its subsequent growth process. Also Eragon beginning with seeing the dragon as a mere animal. So there's a few things I'd like to mention from this particular chapter. I appreciate the magical link between human or elf and dragon that Paolini has created. I think it's a great idea. And I think the history of that idea that we learn in Chapter 6 is amazing. I really appreciate that. I think it's a great idea. It brings together two iconic fantasy novel characters, being elves and dragons, and of course humans as well, and it kind of puts a twist on it. A normal elf, which is an iconic fantasy character, and a dragon, iconic fantasy character, and it's making something more of that by having a dragon rider, that connection piece. I also like the feline-like qualities of the dragon in its newborn state. I think it's a dragon in Christopher Paolini's book, BAM, is a fitting mix of feline and reptile. I think that's awesome. I mostly like how Paolini introduces the mental link, and how at first it actually freaks Eragon out, which I'm sure would freak us out just the same. The idea that the mind is far-reaching is an old idea, and the idea that telepathy is possible is an old idea. But the transition from ordinary life to telepathic life, I've never read anything about that. So that's a really neat idea, and a really neat thing that he puts in here is Eragon's struggle with the transition between normal lifestyle and normal thought patterns to a telepathic lifestyle and actually experiencing a connection with someone else's mind. I like the description. Now on to Chapter 6. We're at 251 and going strong. But BAM! Here we have our second experience with Broms. Broms, our first experience was the storytelling that he did. So we know that he's a storyteller. We know that he's a sage. The information that he gives Eragon this time gives us, as well as the reader, invaluable information, and there's a few things that I wanted to mention from this interview. Number one, the name of the riders, according to the ancient language and the elves, is Shurtagal, which means dragon rider. And then there's other names that we'll learn later on. The Empire, also we learned the Empire is half the size of the lands that the riders held. Interesting thing about that. A lot of people are like, oh, the Empire is only half the size of the rider. Anyway, I think that's a huge testament to Galbatorix's power. He is one rider, he's one dude, and he's got half the size of the lands that all of the riders held. So we don't know exactly how many riders there were, but they only held twice as much land as one guy, Galbatorix, does. So, and we learned in previous chapters that he was taught by a shade, a lot of dark arts, a lot of dark magic. We also know he's hundreds of years old. His dragon is old. So this guy's a powerful guy. To be able to hold as much land as he does by himself, that's pretty powerful. Also, we know that he uses some dark forces, a shade and the Razak, and things that we'll learn later on as we go through the book. But that's pretty powerful. So here we are now to the next point. Broms gives the riders a realistic light. He says that there's a lot of fantastical things written about the riders that may give you the impression that they are like lesser gods, but he says, look, they're just as mortal as the next guy. If they get their head chopped off, they're done. We learn that dragons, dwarves, and a few others are the true inhabitants of this land. Question: who are the few others? I can't quite remember, and I've read these books probably 5 times. I can't quite remember if that's ever addressed. So that will be something that I'm looking for this time around as I'm going through these books. Who are the other true inhabitants of this land? We know it's not the elves or the humans or the Urgals. We learned also that dragons suffer as the land suffers, and that they were from the beginning, which reminds me again of the theory of the spine actually being just that, the spine of a very, very ancient dragon that was of the land and now has become part of the land. So, interesting point. Dragons suffer as the land suffers. They are intimately acquainted with their surroundings. We learn that elves come from a land that they call Alalea. None but they know what or where it is. My question is, why haven't the elves returned there? If Galbatorix is an evil king and things are going to crap, they must really love where they're at right now, which we know where they're at right now, but currently in Chapter 5 we have no idea where they're at right now. So they must really love where they're at to not leave and to go back to their home, or they're unable to return to their home. They know where it is and they know what it is, but they haven't gone back. So there's a question there, and that is something I hope Paolini will address. We learn that the elves first viewed dragons as mere animals, much like Eragon currently in this conversation does. Even though he has associated with my dragon, he still has an animalistic view of the dragon. We learn Eragon's namesake, and ironically, Eragon the original also found an egg, as Eragon II did. We also learn that Eragon the original kept him secretly, as Eragon II did, and that Eragon the original waited until his dragon matured, which, well, we don't know that yet, but that will happen. Anyways, we learn also that Eragon and his dragon Biddom traveled among the dragons to make peace. Obviously, the dragons were winning the war then, and perhaps the dragons are a more reasonable race than the elves, more reasonable in talking with and making peace treaties with. Broms admits to the greatest mystery in allegation. Now, I'm going to do this like 20,000 times. What the heck am I doing with my hands? Anyways, Broms admits that the greatest mystery is how many dragons are still alive. Are there any left? How many died? We don't know any of these things. Other than the 4 sworn dragons, all others are reported to be killed. And, interesting point here, he mentions in his story before that Shurikan, Galbatorix's dragon, was taken as a hatchling, not as an egg. So that's interesting to remember that as well. I don't know why, it just is. We learn that dragons can be huge, which we have discussed before, mistaken for large hills. Dragons can apparently live forever. They have... Did you hear that? Dragons have innate magical power, seemingly uncontrolled by them, that affects everything around them. Human riders over time will look more like elves, and both elf and human riders were granted extra strength and all that other stuff, greater magical power. Then at the end of Chapter 6, we come up to the end and we see then the transition between Eragon thinking dragons are animals to actually recognizing them as an intelligent race. He says, were dragons smart? And Broms says, of course they were! And he growls and does his Brom thing and his big beard. So we learn that riders' great deeds were accomplished because of the dragons, and this amazing connection between them had unforeseen results, as dragon magic usually does. Don't know how much magic you have experienced lately, get some. Thank you for your support. Feel free to comment and respond.